Chapter 2. In her late teens, Sharon McGinnis had tried most of the synth drugs that her peers were into, and had been unimpressed. They'd been fun for an experimentation stint, and she still didn't regret knowing what she'd been missing. But for the most part, being separated from organised thought for days at a time had gotten old real fast. Not to mention, a few of her less stable acquaintances had developed actual habits, and just faded away into unwashed cluelessness, a fate much worse than reality. What she had hated even more than the loss of coherency had been the mornings after, crawling out of bed in the late afternoon with sticky teeth and a vague nausea, combined with a definite sense of brain death. It was, all in all, not a particularly attractive package. And look at me now. All of the aftermath and none of the fun, because I'm a grown-up. Whee! McGinnis sat hunched over her thermos and waited for the sense of crappy instant coffee to do something for her brain. 6 or 7 of the guys milled around, grunting and shuffling in a post-sleep trance. Like her, they had made their way to the mess hall ASAP, hoping that nourishment of some kind would help, and knowing that it never did. Even the tepid shower had hardly been worth the effort, the recycled spray barely penetrating the numb fogginess. Fucking age of nanotechnology, and nobody has come up with a decent cup of instant coffee. That, from fellow Lieutenant Corey, said to no one in particular. The young officer stood by the dispenser, looking like a rumpled zombie, eyes deeply circled by shadow. Grunts from the grunts, and McGinnis smiled weakly in his direction. He had a point. She'd give her left tip for a double espresso. Well, maybe. Corey suddenly straightened up and managed a half-assed salute. "Sir?" McGinnis turned her blurry gaze to the door, then started to stand, officer on deck. "At ease, as you were." McGinnis slouched back down, wondering how the colonel did it. Crespi had been up as long as they had, but he looked crisp and wide awake, his deep voice strong and clear, like he'd just woken up from a restful sleep, and then gone jogging. Bastard. The doctors studied their bleary faces as they settled back into their respective stupors. She didn't know Crespi well, except by reputation. Cold, precise, not a creative genius, but relentless in his attention to detail. In other words, the perfect scientist. Not to mention, as by-the-book marine as they came. He had maybe 10 TS on her, although it didn't show much. Except for the lines of his face, he had the physique of a much younger man. His dark eyes were bright and sharp, set into craggy features like hawk's eyes. Missing nothing. McGinnis snapped out of her weary musing as she realized that he was watching her in turn, a couple of meters in front of her table. He raised one eyebrow quizzically. She cleared her throat. I don't feel well, sir." The colonel sat down in one of the moulded chairs across from her. "Neither do I, McGinnis. In fact, I think I must feel as bad as you look." A few raspy chuckles around the room. Great. Crespi wore the barest hint of a smirk. She closed her mouth before it could get her into trouble, and rolled her head back, stared at the plastiform ceiling. "Yes, sir, I'm feeling fine now, and I hope you soon will be too." This time, the snickers were disguised as minor coughing fits. McGinnis straightened her shoulders and looked at the colonel, who smiled openly now. "No question, Lieutenant. Your recovery has been an inspiration to us all." Well, at least he had some sense of humour. The others went back to their shuffling and monosyllabic conversations. McGinnis waited for Crespi to say something else, but he held silent, went back to watching the crew as they stumbled around aimlessly. She felt a deep twinge in her gut, the tightening of a fist that had lain there for too long. It was time to find out what he knew. She took a sip of the watery coffee and tried to sound uninterested in his answer. "Will I be working under you on board the Innominata, sir?" Crespi turned his sharp gaze back to her. "Not likely, McGinnis. Not if your luck holds. I expect to be deeply involved in some excruciatingly banal series tests." Was it her imagination, or was that bantering tone a cover? The knot in her belly tightened. He was a tough read, but if she had to place bets, she'd say he was as uninformed as the rest of them. "Sounds good to me," she said, and looked away, continued with the feigned boredom. The Innominata is a little too hush-hush, too, didn't happen, never was, to suit my taste. Crespi leaned closer. If that's the case, why did you volunteer for this tour? McGinnis shrugged. Good question. And you don't need to know the answer, sir. Several beats of silence. She finally glanced at him, noted the frown above those piercing eyes as he studied her face. He seemed about to say something else. A voice crackled out over the comm. Colonel Dr. Crespi, sir. Colonel Thompson wishes to see you on the upper bridge before landing, sir. Crespi stared at her for another second, then looked away. Very good. He stood, nodded at her, and then walked away from the table. McGinnis sipped again from her thermos, relieved. He was quick, maybe too quick, but that might turn out to be an asset. One of the men made some crack that she didn't quite hear, but she laughed along with the rest of them and stared down at her pale hands that suddenly trembled, ever so slightly.